Welcome to AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. Educate. Celebrate. Connect. Arizona Hispanic Connection.
Good morning, everyone. This is AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection, with another very, very interesting, exciting, informative program. And the name of the program today is Fruits of Latino Activism. Today, there is a space in the American life, in the American culture that Latinos enjoyed. It hasn't always been so. It's I would say, a pretty good space that Latinos enjoy, but it has been the fruit of years and years and of people and organizations that have made it happen. It just didn't happen. Sometimes we'll call it La CAUSA, right? Even we have an organization locally that whose name is Chicanos por la Causa. So there's always been individuals and organizations to whom la causa has literally meant their whole lives, and they have sacrificed pretty much all their lives to fight, to struggle, to advocate, to empower, to debate, to make the situation that Latinos currently enjoy happen. So at least on my part, I'm a rookie, if you will, in these endeavors. I feel a deep sense of gratitude towards what has happened in the past. We basically came when the table was served with all the foods and all the decorations. And even though it's not perfect, I think we would agree that the table is served and we are able to enjoy food that others have struggled to put on the table. So today that's going to be the subject, fruits of Latino activism. There's just too much that we enjoy today, and we don't want to take it for granted. There has been a lot of suffering, a lot of work that has been put into all this to make it happen. Let me first introduce our guest today, and then we're going to start the conversation. To my left, we have Roberto Reveles. And Roberto, you have been an activist for pretty much all your life. And I want to thank you and I want to welcome you to our show.
Pues muchísimas gracias, David. I'm very pleased to be here because I think recalling history and promoting history is something that we have an obligation to do. And I appreciate David Barra, AARP, putting this kind of information out here to the public. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto, and thank you for all your life and dedication to La Causa of Hispanics. And by the way, today we use Latinos, but in the beginning it was Mexicans, then it became Mexican Americans, then it became Chicanos, then it became Hispanics, then it became Latinos, and now there's also another term, Latinx. So the names have evolved. For the most part, in the beginning of history, it referred to Mexican Americans, but then as Central America, folks from Central America, South America, and the Caribbean have come to this country, then there's a sense of unity and in the efforts, and that's why currently we call ourselves or we identify this group as Latinos. To my right is Frank Barrios. And Frank, again, thank you for everything that you've done. I'm sure that if you look at your life, you have to agree that all of it has been involved in one shape or form with La Causa, correct? And welcome to our show.
Thank you very much. Yes, my father was very involved in La Causa. He did a lot of things, and I like to think as he passed on, he handed me a gauntlet to continue the work that he had done. And everything you've just said, it's an honor to be here with Roberto, who's done so much to help the Latino cause. And you're right, what you just said earlier, there's a whole history of things that have been done, and people forget that the things that we take for granted today weren't always there.
Right.
And it took a lot of work by a lot of people to get those changes. And that's why I really thank you for what you're doing here and letting people know that there's a whole history, a whole building of things that occurred and continue clear to today.
You know, I was talking to my wife before coming here as I was having breakfast, and I was telling her that because I'm an immigrant from the state of Nayarit, Mexico, and I was telling her that to my recollection, I thought that the Simpson-Massoli immigration law that passed was the one where my dad and her dad basically took advantage of to be here. But actually, that didn't happen like that. It happened even earlier. So my point is that, you know, when new immigrants come to this country, I think it's in our best interest to understand history, because it hasn't always been like this. Somebody had to struggle. And again, as I already said it, the struggles of so many people have literally served the table with lots of delicious foods, and the newcomers like myself, we just came in and start eating. But there's been a whole group of people who have spent their whole lives fighting for La Causa, and we owe it to ourselves to know that the history and to be thankful and connected to that history. So let me continue again to my right. We also have Petra Falcon, and it is a privilege and an honor, Petra, to have you join. I know you are extremely busy, and we struggle to get you here. So thank you so very much for all your life, all your dedication, everything that you've ever done for La Causa, and welcome to our show.
Well, good morning to my brothers here around the table, and thank you, David, for this invitation. These conversations are important for all the things that you were saying, but it is a moment of opportunity for our community, and we need to embrace it rather than perhaps think, okay, it's a mess. Let's deal with it. Let's just go and lean into what's going on in our country, in our communities, and be neighbors. Let's just be good neighbors.
So basically what I gather is that La Lucha Sigue is not done. There's still issues to be addressed.
Absolutely, and I think there's a lot of young people that have been working very, very hard. But that's why we need to have these conversations, because of what you said. This has been a long struggle. It just hasn't been the last decade. It's been decades. And when I was a teenager, I mean, I can tell you who was coming up at the time. People like Alfredo Gutierrez and Raul Castro and Mary Rose Wilcox and Rosie Lopez, and people that basically I grew up around them,
right.
and so I've been very blessed.
And I'm going to come back in a next segment or two to kind of ask you, each of you, to kind of relate your story about what you were involved in and who were the players at that time, and how that motivated you to be involved in activism. And we also have Tio Tachias, and Tio Tachias is also a man who has participated very, very actively in La Causa and the struggles and in the advocacy efforts against. The show today is called Fruits of Latino Activism. I mean, everything that we enjoy today is fruits of a lot of work. So Tio Tachias, welcome to our show, and thank you so very much for your life and dedication to the efforts of the Latino cause.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I've been involved for many, many years. I've known Roberto Reveles forever, it seems like. He was one of the early movers and shakers. I go back to 1964 when I first got elected to the Board of Supervisors in Coconino County. There were just a handful of lawyers in this state, a handful, and less than a handful of doctors. You check the rosters. If there were rosters today, there's hundreds of both, and so we've advanced. In the early days, the people that strived in in their lives that were successful in high school, as an example, I would take a guess that maybe 90% of them went to teaching. Most of the kids that went to school before me, most of the bright kids ended up teaching, and later on they got into other areas. But things have changed. But a lot of the problems that we're discussing now and affected by are problems that we had way before my time.
Right. And again, you're listening to AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. The name of this program is Fruits of Latino Activism. And we're going to be getting into the conversation deeper as we move on. I would like to read something here. Immigrants have had to struggle for rights, recognition against discrimination, and other. And many are those individuals and organizations who have fought for La CAUSA. Who are they? How have they contributed? Thanks to all of them, Latinos today enjoy a much better space than ever before. But there's still work to be done. I would like to relate or start relating a little bit about the history, how it all started, because it almost seems like the U.S. and Mexico have like a cousin relationship, sometimes a brother relationship, sometimes husband and wife, and it always keeps changing. We're neighbors, right? As we know, 1776, the United States of America gained its independence from Great Britain. In 1810, Mexico gained its independence from Spain. Disputes over territory and other issues between these two neighboring countries led to the Mexican-American War and eventually to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and where Mexico lost some 67% of its territory to the U.S. Mexican territory then included Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, Nevada, California, and other land. Due to this, many Mexican nationals became U.S. citizens by virtue of now being in U.S. land from one day to the next. In 1882 to 1910, U.S. railroad companies contracted Mexican nationals to build a railroad. It is estimated that more than 16,000 Mexicans were working on the railroads by the early 1900s, representing some 60% of Americans' railroad labor force at that time. Political unrest in Mexico eventually led to the Mexican Revolution in 1910, which led to many Mexicans migrating to the United States. By 1930, the U.S. Census counts 600,000 Mexican immigrants residing in the U.S., up from 200,000 in 1910. Mexicans comprise less than 5% of the immigrant workforce, not including undocumented immigrants. I will continue with these points about the history in our next segment. Thank you for staying with us. This is AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. We'll be right back.
Welcome to AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. Educate. Celebrate. Connect. Arizona Hispanic Connection.
Thank you. Thank you for staying with us. This is AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. The name of our program today is Fruits of Latino Activism. And again, everything that Latinos enjoy today has been a fruit that has required a lot of labor by a lot of people. We could even say there has been blood shed for this. And I actually, we shouldn't say could even. I mean, lots of blood shed to get the spaces, to gain the spaces that Latinos enjoy today, both politically, economically, in business. It's been a struggle, and situations are much better. And like Petra Falcon just told us, there's still things to be addressed. Let me just finish the few points that I have related to history. I'm in point 9. In 1929 to 1939, this is like a decade, the Great Depression hit. And Americans began to view Mexicans as competitors for jobs as well as a drain on social services. This led to the repatriation program of Mexicans and Mexican Americans. Here's where we see that even Dr. Santos Vega's dad was deported, being a U.S. citizen, and many, many others. Additionally, hundreds of thousands more, weary of the changed climate, returned to Mexico voluntarily. Then obviously during this time we have World War I, which also brought in a lot of immigrants from Mexico to the U.S. Then World War II hits in 1942, which leads to shortage on the labor force and eventually to the Bracero program. The program focused on the agricultural and railroad industries, but rights were not honored. A base wage level, housing, medical care, and food were supposed to be the rights that they were supposed to have, but it didn't happen. So there was a lot of need to advocate and struggle for those. The program ends in 1964. Some 4.5 million Mexican workers were sponsored. 3 more points. In 1954, we have Operation Wetback, a forced repatriation program that led to several million Mexican nationals being sent back to Mexico. In 1986, we have the Immigration Reform and Control Act signed by President Reagan. I believe this allowed several millions,
2 million.
2 million people to get their permanent residency to the United States. Then, as we know, 2012, President Barack Obama established DACA, and we also know that the current President Trump is ending DACA as we know it. So this is a brief, very brief history of how this relationship, or the main points of the relationship between the United States of America and the United States of Mexico, because I think that's the actual name that Mexico has, is the United States of Mexico, Estados Unidos Mexicanos. So thank you again to my guest, and we agree, I believe, when we're off the air, that Roberto Reveles would probably got engaged in this struggle earlier than the four of you. So Roberto, why don't you relate to us, help us understand your involvement, how you got involved, who inspired you, who were key players, people, organizations, etc., if you don't mind.
Well, let me set the stage this way. I was born and raised 90 miles from here in Miami, Arizona. Clearly a U.S.-born citizen. However, my total life in this small copper mining community was one of experiencing segregation in every aspect of life. I think it's important for today's public to understand what is it that gave us the motivation that stimulated us, that led to the so-called activism that we've been involved in. Well, it was a life comparable to mine, and mine was not unique. This was common living experience in Arizona, especially in the small mining communities, where I lived in a segregated housing area, attended a segregated school, attended a segregated church, attended a segregated movie house. Segregation was what formed my social conscience and my zeal for activism that continues to this day.
Obviously, being born in Miami, you were a U.S. citizen.
Yes.
Right.
Despite that, it is interesting that many people look around and say, why are you so involved? Well, learn the history. Know a little bit of what led to us becoming so-called activists. And so I became a questioner at an early age while I was in public school. And during high school, I remember, for example, an incident where we were invited as a social studies class to attend a meeting of the local school board. They were discussing whether to give a contract to an African-American teacher because the African-American school had closed. And we were told before the meeting, you are here only to listen. I could not sit and just listen. I raised my hand and I asked the question, why is it that this teacher, who was clearly qualified to teach in a segregated African-American school, is now being questioned as to whether she has the credentials to teach in an integrated school? And so my curiosity has followed me throughout my life. But that's how I became involved.
In terms of leaders of your in those days, who can you name that inspire you, that were active in those days, and what kind of efforts were they involved in?
Good question, because being in what was a relatively isolated community, I would wonder what's happening in the big cities of Tucson and Phoenix. And I heard the name James Conrad Carrion. James Conrad Carrion was one of the early activists that came into my life. And he was someone who motivated me and inspired me because he was successfully challenging the racist policies of that day. There are other names that come to mind. Ralph Estrada, an attorney. The Alianza Hispanoamericana. Bill Soltero. Maclovio Barraza, labor leaders, social organization leaders, and church leaders. There were some local priests that made their alliance openly with the Latinos.
Thank you so much, Roberto. Can we go to Tio? And Tio, you grew up in the Flagstaff area, if I remember right.
Yes.
You were also a little bit separate from this area of the Phoenix area, as yourself, Roberto, in Miami. Were you involved? How did you get engaged in activism?
Well, it's hard to say. I hate to bring history that far back, but I was really enthused about politics when I was in the late 40s. I heard that Harry Truman was coming through our community in the train. They used to campaign by train in those days. He had been elevated to president when Roosevelt died, and he ran against Tom Dewey. I think he was the governor of New York. Anyway, I went to see him in the morning. I just wanted to see what a U.S. president looked like. So I went, and there were about 40 people there in Flagstaff. That was a lot of people. And he talked about his campaign, and he said, I'm going to win this election. They were polling then. He says, I don't care what the polls say. And he pointed at me. I thought he pointed at me. He says, with your help, I'm going to get elected president. So there I was. I had the duty to get him elected president. I went through almost every house in Flagstaff asking people to vote for Harry Truman. You didn't find out who won until the next day in those days, When I found out, I really thought that I had done my job and gotten him elected.
Great.
That's
Now, you were, the last time we had you on the show, you were involved with Raul H. Castro. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Well, there was a teacher in Flagstaff in the 6th grade by the name of Ernesto Castro, and he happened to be brother to a judge in Pima County by the name of Raul Castro. And we had an organization called the American Coordinating Council on Political Education. There were several chapters around the state. We had a real good one in Flagstaff, so we decided to have a dinner, and who do we invite, So I asked Ernesto if he could contact his brother, Raul. Raul came to Flagstaff. He agreed, and he made an impression. I mean, there were about 50 people there. He made a real impression. That's how I got.
Again, for anyone who doesn't know, Raul H. Castro was the first and only Mexican-American governor in Arizona in 74, I believe? 1974.
Yes. I worked on his campaign, and I learned a lot from him and from others. And, one thing about the state of Arizona, there's a lot of leadership that has surfaced over the years. But I really believe that the biggest contribution to activism and to political activity and all comes from the mining communities. When I was in college, there were these guys that always wanted to join this organization. They wanted to clean up this and do all that. And I got to thinking, why do these guys volunteer for all these things?
And we're going to have to go on break and we're going to have to do a show on Miami and mining. I mean, isn't Pastor from Miami? Isn't Santos Vega? Raul Castro was from the Douglas area. I mean, there's a lot of leaders from that, and we're going to do a show. Sorry to interrupt you, but we have to go on break. This is AARP Arizona Hispanic Connection. We'll be right back.
Welcome to AARP Arizona Hispanic Connection. Educate. Celebrate. Connect. Arizona Hispanic Connection.
Thank you for staying with us. This is AARP Arizona Hispanic Connection. We are talking about fruits of Latino activism. I mean, there's a lot of fruits that have been produced by the efforts of so many people throughout the years, and anybody who knows the history has to feel a sense of gratitude for those of us newcomers who came when as I put it, the table was served already. Before we go to Frank Barrios to kind of relate to us the same matter of how he got involved, let me just talk a little bit about the space that Latinos, or the spaces that Latinos enjoy today. In the executive branch, we have Alex Acosta from Florida. He is the Secretary of Labor. So even in the executive branch with President Trump's administration, they have Alex Acosta. In the judicial branch, who do we have? Sonia Sotomayor, a Supreme Justice. And obviously, there has to be many judges in several states. I would have to have done a lot of research to get their names. In the legislative branch, we have in Arizona, Congressman Ed Pastor, who have retired, Raul Grijalva, Ruben Gallegos. In California, names such as Linda Sanchez, Devin Nunez. In New Mexico, Ben Ray Lujan. In Florida, Carlos Curbelo. Governors, we had Raul H. Castro in Arizona, Susana Martinez in New Mexico. Bill Richardson was prior to her the governor of New Mexico. And then we have Brian Sandoval. He's the current governor of Nevada. We also have had attorney generals. Remember Alberto Gonzalez with the Bush administration? He was an attorney general at the federal level, of course. And then Javier Becerra at the state level in California. He is the current attorney general for California. We'll come back in the next segment more locally at the state level. We have our legislators.
Who was our treasurer? Remember there was a treasurer?
Romana Bañuelos, born in Miami, Arizona.
Here we go again, Miami.
Was the first Latina named United States treasurer out of Miami. the first Hispanic named United States Commissioner of Education, Eddie Aguirre.
Wow.
So-
Roberto, you're going to have to help me to put together a show just on Miami, Arizona, or Miami. Frank, let's go to you. I've known you for a few years now, and you've always been involved. I mean, you were involved with St. Vincent de Paul. I know you're a LULAC member, and you wrote a book about Mexicans of Phoenix. Can you relate to us your involvement, what you have seen, what you have witnessed, leaders, organizations, and here in Arizona?
Thank you, David. My major contribution has been in history, developing history and putting together. But just to mention, my father, if he were alive today, he'd be 110 years old. But he was a very, very active in the Mexican cause, CAUSA, like you said. His name was Alfonso Barrios, and he worked with Post 41. He was a member of that with Ray Martinez and Pipas Fuentes, and he was a member of LULAC, worked with Julia Sosaya and Jean Marin, they very closely. So on my part, the real activism was through my father, and I met all of these people all my life while growing up. And then my grandfather was involved in when they built Immaculate Heart, when the Mexican community broke away from St. Mary's and built Immaculate Heart. My grandfather was the treasurer of the group, the Mexican Catholic Society, that did that. So I've got a family history. I myself am an engineer. I numbers 2 + 2 and so on.
Right.
But I get involved where I can. But my involvement came through my family and meeting all of the people that we're talking about today, the activists, and I met so many of them. And of course, many of the heroes. That I remember, people like Joe Eddie Lopez and Rosie. They were, again, from the Mineros.
Really? Come on.
And make sure, if you're listening, it's not Miami, it's Miami.
We have to do a show just on Miami.
But there were so many of them. You could make a list. Alfredo. They all were young.
Even Alfredo Gutierrez,
yes.
who was the minority leader. He was also from Miami.
Yes.
Amazing.
And Ed Pastor,
Right.
and just you can go on and on. There were, but they all were students at ASU when Chicanos por la Causa began, and most of them came over and started Chicanos por la Causa. Young students, ASU, kids who were brought up from the mining towns, and they were on fire. It was in the 60s, and they wanted to see change, but there was also change to them. The change didn't occur fast enough, so they jumped in there and began to do a lot of activism. But there's also, after World War II, don't forget Post 41 and all the work they did.
Definitely.
And a little different crowd. They weren't, they did it, they were activists. And then you had the beginning of in those days it was called the Mexican Chamber of Commerce, later became the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. And all of this came right after World War II. Then the young activists started in the 60s. And again, this was all because what Roberto said earlier, there was segregation, and people remember that, and the goal was to try to eliminate segregation and the fight again. Many of the things there's so many stories of where they weren't allowed in the movie theaters. There's so many. The blacks, the Mexicans. There was a lot of Southern type mentality that was here in Arizona.
So there is a saying in Spanish that says, "El que no habla, Dios no lo oye. Al que no habla, Dios no lo oye." I mean, this basically speaks to the fact that in a democracy, activism, it's just, it has to happen. I mean, if you don't speak up, if you don't say anything, nothing's going to happen. So can we now move to Petra Falcon? And Petra, and I apologize because I know I'm not going to remember the name of the award you just got at the NCLR conference. Can you tell me the name of that award, first of all? What was it called?
It's called the Otley Award.
Okay.
And it's given by the Mexican government.
Perfect. You have about 3 minutes, and then we can pick it up on the last segment. Again, same question. How did you get involved in activism?
I think it's because it was so obvious, the segregation, the lack of opportunities. Your teachers were not people of color. Anywhere you went, people who were in charge or had the positions in government, they were not people of color. And then of course I was a reader, and in the history books, you didn't have any people of color either that were becoming elected officials or president or astronauts. So that caught my curiosity, Roberto, just like you. I said, why not? So that meant you're right. We needed to start raising our hands. And I started raising my hands early in my life, in elementary school and in high school.
That early, huh?
But the opportunity for me to really engage in the bigger picture was when I went to ASU, and the first person I met as I entered a Mecha meeting, because the first thing I wanted to do was get involved.
And Mecha was started by Alfredo Gutierrez. I'm reading his book, To Sin Against Hope, and I think he is credited by starting Mecha.
Well, it was the first person I encountered was Daniel Ortega at a Mecha meeting.
Okay.
And then of course Alfredo, and they were organizing some kind of event. But at that time, the first fight that I remember really getting involved with was hiring people of color at the university. We just didn't have any. Right. And the second thing, we wanted to make sure that there were more people of color, Latinos especially, to be recruited to go to universities, because there wasn't enough there. So again, there was just these separations, big distinctions. And how did we have a role in anything at any level of public life? And that's what really grabbed me. And I too, in 1974, I was 19 years old, and Raúl Castro's campaign was my first political campaign.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
So you were very active in his campaign.
Yeah, well, I was at the bottom. I was a grunt. I mean, I say that because...
What was the feeling of having a Mexican American run for governor and then eventually win?
I at that moment, I'm not sure, because I was so young, I did not understand the significance, because even today, people don't know that. If you talk to a lot of our young people, they don't have a clue that we were able to accomplish that, and what surrounded the momentum. And it was the farm worker movement. It was the farm worker movement that played a significant role in the early politics of the state of Arizona.
Were you somehow also involved with the Cesar Chavez
movement? On campus at ASU, yes. I mean, the organizers, they came and recruited young people. I remember going to Eloy and going out to the fields, because I'm from Glendale. I'm from the west side, and I come from a little barrio that used to be called Sonorita, and it's almost not there anymore.
Wow.
But
amazing.
Yes, and so yes, I got involved in the farm worker movement and spent a lot of time with a lot of young people out in the fields.
Thank you so very much. We have to go on our last break. You're listening to AARP Arizona Hispanic Connection. We'll be right back.
Welcome to AARP Arizona Hispanic Connection. Educate. Celebrate. Connect. Arizona Hispanic Connection.
Thank you for staying with us. This is AARP Arizona Hispanic Connection, our last segment, Latinos, or I should say fruits of Latino activism. Lots of fruits, lots of results, lots of good things, lots of spaces that have been gained by the efforts of Latinos from the past and the present, and even current younger activists that are that they don't stop addressing the issues of our time. So thanks to all of them. And I wanted to just finish the list of people that enjoy spaces today. Let's go to the state level. We have Ana Tovar. Actually, is the would she be considered the first mayor of in Arizona of a city? But Ana Tovar is the mayor of Tolleson.
Gomez.
Yeah, well, he used to be actually. That's correct. That's correct.
But there are mayors in the mining communities.
And in Somerton,
There we
San
go.
Luis.
There we go.
Yeah, so lots of
here
mayors.
we go again with minors, community minors. Okay, let me just mention that currently we have senators Lupe Contreras, Juan Mendez, Roberto Mesa, Catherine Miranda, Steve Montenegro, Lisa Atondo, and Martin Quesada. We have those legislators. They're senators. And then representatives, we have Richard Andrade, Isela Blanc, Mark Cárdenas, Cesar Chavez, Diego Espinosa, Charlene Fernandez, Rosana Gabaldón, Sally Ann González, Daniel Hernández, Ray Martínez, Tony Navarrete, Rebeca Ríos, Tony Rivero, Jesús Rubalcaba, and Macario Saldate. So these are current legislators. There are a few, and this did not exist before. So that's why I wanted to call this show Fruits of Latino Activism.
The very first elected state legislator was Jimmy Carrion. And in late 1940s, he was elected to the state legislature. And then Adam Diaz, the first city councilman for here. And you had people like Val Cordova, the judge. You just listed a name of lots of folks, but there had to be the first.
Yes.
And the first, Jimmy Carrion was probably the first elected Mexican-American to serve. And then I believe after him, you had, like Adam Diaz was until 1950s. And Roberto,
Well, I wanted to add, just to add to that perspective, when I started work in the Congress in Washington, D.C., there were Senator Dennis Chavez, Representative Antonio Fernandez, Representative Henry B. Gonzalez. That was the representation in the entire United States Congress.
Wow. This is what year about?
The year was 1956.
Right. So we have to agree that though we enjoy a pretty good sized space in the American life today, and this is just fruits of the labor and the advocacy and the empowerment and the debating and the activism that has taken place. Obviously, Alfredo Gutierrez, Jaime Gutierrez, and many others. And when you start mentioning names, you feel bad because I know you, Raúl Grijalva, Pete Rios, of course.
Yeah. But recognize that there were, in addition to the elected officials, that they were supported by community leaders like that came out of the labor movement, like Maclovio Barraza from Tucson, like Bill Soltero from Phoenix, and another gentleman from the labor movement here, Benitez, I can't remember his first name. But these were support mechanisms that were in place, institutionalized in place. And I think it's important to recognize that the strength of personalities has to be replaced by institutions.
Right.
And that's why I am grateful that LULAC is still in place as the oldest Latino civil rights organization in the nation.
And I always go to that one because we've named individuals. How about we name a few of the organizations? You have the GI Forum, even though this was not here. Was it New Mexico?
No,
or
in Texas.
Texas.
Organized by Dr. Hector Garcia.
That's correct. And then LULAC, 1929, Corpus Christi, Texas. You have the Southwest Council of La Raza, and then NCLR, and then Unidos now. You have NALEO, National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, MALDEF, Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, Friendly House, Valle del Sol,
Chicanos por la
Causa.
And also it was Southwest Voter Registration that was the first major voter registration
yes.
for Latinos.
Let me say that was founded by Willie Velasquez from San Antonio, Texas. I was part of a group in Washington, D.C. that was lobbying for bringing in young Latinos and Latinas into Washington to the State Department. The first crop that came in included Willie Velasquez, and there were others from that group. One of them became a professor of law at Stanford University from this group of Chicanos. There in Washington, there was a handful of us. For example, I helped organize the first consumer boycott in support of farm workers east of the Mississippi. After speaking with Cesar Chavez, who told me he needed help on the East Coast.
Wow.
And so we institutionalized those organizations. I was chairman of the American GI Forum chapter in Washington, D.C. I was helped by Raul Izaguirre, former ambassador.
And by the way, Raul Izaguirre, a book was written on him by Estela Pope Duarte called Seated at the Table of Power.
And I was invited by Ambassador Izaguirre to go to the Dominican Republic with Stella Pope Duarte to help him recollect the details that went into that biography.
I just read about that. So you went on that trip to Dominican Republic
with Stella,
right,
accompanying her to help her
when she was writing the book.
She was writing the book on Raul Izaguirre. We helped organize there in Washington, D.C., a group called National Organization for Mexican American Services. There's nothing national about it other than the aspiration of becoming a network that led, incidentally, to the founding of the Southwest Council of La Raza, that led then to the National Council of La Raza.
You know, Luz Armina, she retired, I believe. She was the CEO of Valle del Sol. And then David Adame, CEO of Chicanos por la Causa. We've had CEOs. I have met so many doctors these days that I'm very, very pleasantly surprised. We have doctors with the Hispanic community, a lot of people with masters. I mean, the space is pretty broad. I believe a lot has been gained. And again, it has been the fruit of many years, of many people, and of many organizations. To advance.
David, let me inject that sadly, our local historians, Frank being one of the exceptions, do not take advantage of primary sources of this history. Some of us who are still alive, who were involved in these activities that occasionally show up in history books. But we have an obligation, our generation has an obligation of recording our history. It's not being done well enough. So again, a compliment to you for teaching this history on your radio program.
Thank you.
And I'd like to comment on that. Roberto hit the nail on the head, because unfortunately there's an old saying about the winners write history. The history of the Mexican Americans, there's fantastic history that's never been documented ever. Why? Because there's groups out there that wanted to document the Anglo history and nothing to do about the minorities and how they contributed. And today, unfortunately, a lot of people don't care about history. They care more about the present or the future. And history, if you don't look back, you're going to repeat some of the terrible things that occurred. Look at all the anti-immigrant. This has happened before, but yet nobody even knows. I think they've rediscovered it. They think it's all brand new.
And I wanted just to make sure that's why ASU and U of A have departments of Mexican American Studies or Chicano Studies, which documents all this history. It needs to be told. We are running out of time. Theo, please.
In talking about leadership and the development of leadership, there's people that have been very significant. Cesar Chavez is an example. A lot of people followed him, but in the early days, people thought he was a radical. Latinos across the state, they thought he was just a rabble rouser and all that. Today, they're saying, "Oh, what a great man," and all that. I remember one day he came to my house. We were at a union meeting and in Flagstaff, and Sonny Montoya, the agent, said, "Can I bring Cesar Chavez to your house for dinner?" Because I had invited him. I said, "Sure." So up he comes to my house after the meetings and all that. They came in with dogs two big dogs, and Cesar Chavez says to me, "Can I bring the dogs through your house?" I couldn't figure out why, but I said sure. So the dogs went through the house, and they put them back in the van. Then we sat down for dinner, and my wife was not political at all, not at all, and we were fighting the lettuce and grapes strikes at that time, and we're sitting there talking, and Cesar Chavez gets a little can out and starts eating from it. He was a vegetarian. And my wife, after a little while, places a big bowl of grapes right in front of me. And there were about 10 of us at the table. And I just about died when she did that. And he looked at me and said, "Tio, don't worry. I know these grapes came from Chile." So he had a good sense of humor. And
Thank you. You know, we run out of time. I want to thank all of you. It's been an amazing show, just lots of history. And thank you again for all your service to this country and particularly to the Latino community. Just be very brief. We only have seconds.
I'd like to say that it's been a privilege to be here, David. It's been a privilege because of these three people. I mean, I've known them I've known Bobby when he was in Washington, and they're just great.
Thank you, Tio. Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, Petra. Thank you, Frank. This is not going to be the last show, promise. We have to do more of these. So we hope you enjoyed this show. This was AARP Arizona Hispanic Connection, with the name of this show today being Fruits of Latino Activism. Have a great day.